One of the things we're going to talk about quite a bit in this course is a bunch of different scientific names over and over again. And these names have very specific meaning to them. And this is what we call taxonomy and phylogenetics. And the idea that things are related to each other and kind of fit into our hierarchy has been central to biology since really evolution was thought of as an important theory. In fact, Charles Darwin in his notebook sketched what we think are some of the first phylogenetic trees there are. So an important note to think about when we talk about scientific names and the reason why we use them. Scientific names are what we consider, they're Latinized. So we're not actually speaking Latin when you talk about various different taxa. What we are is we're taking other different languages and pretending they're Latin. So we Latinize them. A lot of times these are also from Greek, but increasingly in our more globally connected society, we've been seeing a lot of other names, especially English names and Chinese names, kind of getting into our current botanical naming schemes. These Latin names have a really distinct advantage over over common names. Common names are very limited in scope, and often these common names are limited to one language. Even though that our scientific names are Latinized, they're still able to be more accessible to more people around the globe. Common names also have geographic variation to them. I can't tell you over the states I've lived in how many times you run into a plant that's called a yellow pine here, but a jack pine or a limber pine in other places. And a lot of times, a lot of our plants don't even have common names to them. But probably the biggest issue with common names is that they're not standardized. For instance, these two plants right here are important plants of our agricultural systems. And a lot of times, both of them are called sweet potatoes, even though they're really not related to each other. In fact, sweet potatoes more properly are a member of the morning glory, but then again, yams are another plant in a very different related group. But Latin names will kind of let us be able to distinguish these more accurately than just a sign at the grocery store. One thing that is important to remember about our nomenclature for naming any organism is that they have a lot of Western bias, and it really reflects kind of the colonial history of our Earth. Latin characters use a Latin alphabet, and this Latin alphabet isn't universal throughout the globe. So a lot of times when we're naming names, we have to depend on rules from Latin and using possessives and gender in them. That might be very foreign for a lot of different languages. And really a lot of these names are based on European ideas. In fact, if you go to Japan, a lot of the specific epithets of plants you'll notice would be Thunbergii, named after a European plant collector. Even though these plants have long histories of use and cultivation in Japan, they don't get a Japanese name. And so really these names, a lot of them have been named after people that are part of the club, so to speak. And then this idea of colonization wasn't the same all over the world. In fact, one of the groups I study, monkey flower here, is a very diverse group of hundreds of different species. But there is one kind of aberrant species that grows on the east coast of North America, which was colonized first. And because of particular rules now, all those different species that used to be called mimulus can no longer be called mimulus, and we have to only call this one mimulus, just because Europeans got to Eastern North America first and happened to collect this and put it into a museum. Whenever we talk about a species, we're going to give it what we call a binomial. And that comes from it has two primary words. So the plants you're going to be growing in this class are a variety of Brassica rapa. And that binomial has two parts to it. First is the genus. The genus in this case is Brassica, which is a genera of a bunch of different plants that are known as mustards. But we want to get more specific. So within this genus, we have the specific epithet, and in this case, it's rapa on this. So all these plants that we'll talk about have these kind of two names that make them their official scientific name. The specific epithets of these plants, such as rapa in this case, also follow rules. So there's kind of Latinization that we have to think about when we're putting them into these kind of formal names. But one of the nice things about these formal rules is that they have meaning to them a lot of these times. So these specific epithets can mean various things, such as refer to a morphological trait, like the epithet lanceolatum means a lance-shaped leaf. They can be ecological, such as giving them a sense of like plustrous, that they grow in a wet environment. They can be named after somebody, such as Thunberg Plant Corrector has a lot of plants named Thunbergii. Or they can be named after chemicals, or other way around on that one too. So generally when these plants get named, they're going to have meanings to them. But below the specific epithet, we also get into areas where we might need to give various names to it. If you take your Brassica rapa, for example, Brassica rapa is a very interesting group because it has a really wide variety of different shapes and forms to them. But all these plants are able to breed together and they're considered the same species. And we do this through a lot of different ways. We can describe subspecies, we can describe different varieties of them, and also in horticulture we recognize things such as cultivars or types out there. And these are these infraspecific taxa can get kind of sorted out in various different ways. But for the most part, what you'll see is after the binomial, you'll see another kind of designation, such as something like SSP, which stands for subspecies, and then another name to further clarify them. So in the case of Brassica rapa, we have these various 3 subspecies. We have Brassica rapa subspecies rapa, the turnip, Brassica rapa subspecies picanensis, or Napa cabbage, and Brassica rapa subspecies chinensis, which is one of my favorite vegetables, bok choy. But when we go above the species level, we also see more hierarchies forming. And this is kind of a useful tool for us to understand relationships at a glance by just looking at them. If we think about Brassica rapa, there's a whole lot of information I can get by just looking at that name and understanding what they mean. And as we go from the binomial, which again includes the genus and the species, we go up through things like tribes, subfamilies, families, orders, classes, all the way up to kingdom. And these various orders that we have also we see that they're nested within each other. And they again have very specific rules. So for instance, the genus Brassica is named for the family Brassicaceae, and that's where we get that genus for. And Brassicaceae is named for the order Brassicales. And as we even go up, we get to the class Rosids, which includes, obviously, roses to it. So we know that at a very high taxonomic level, your Brassica rapa is related to roses in this case. The other thing that we're going to really get into in this class is looking at phylogenetic trees. And it's important to kind of remember back to intro biology and what you might have learned about these, because these are going to be coming at you quite a bit. And if we look at this phylogenetic tree of vertebrates, we can kind of get a lot of information out of it. We can see what different groups share a common ancestor, which are represented by these nodes back here. It's important to note that we don't know what this species is, and we never will, because this is a theoretical common ancestor at this point. We also have what you'll see on a lot of these trees is what we call an outgroup. So for instance, vertebrae develop down here, but we have a close group to us, because we're vertebrates, in the lanceolates, that they have some things that might be sort of analogous or primitive to the vertebral column. We also see throughout this phylogeny tree what we call synapomorphies, or shared traits. So if we look up And here we can see that amniotic eggs developed at this point. And turtles and mammals share that amniotic egg sac together, although in mammals it's internal within the female body. We also have what we call derived traits. And these are traits that we see more toward the tips that kind of evolved more recently than other traits. Reason why we call these derived traits instead of advanced traits is because the basal traits, or the primitive traits, so to speak, are not really that primitive. As long as they're working and doing their thing, such as a hinged jaw way back here, tuna are very successful organisms because they're living, they're breeding, and they're passing their genes on. And so that's why we refer to these traits more as derived versus basal instead of advanced or primitive. The other thing we see in phylogenetic trees are kind of two types of trees you'll see a lot. A lot of times you'll see trees that what we call rooted, so they'll have that typical branch trait. But sometimes you might see a more circular tree. These are unrooted. And the reason why we have unrooted versus rooted trees goes back to that outgroup that we have. In this tree, we have a sense that bacteria and archaea are more related to each other, and they're more closely aligned to what we believe that kind of last universal common ancestor was, or LUCA. But on this tree, they're unrooted, and so we don't really know necessarily how closely related the archaea is to the bacteria or is to the eukaryotas at this point. And so you'll see these two different types of trees, which can be interpreted very similarly, but just remember that the rooted trees, we kind of have a clear picture of the sequence of evolution that happened. And so in this unrooted tree, this is kind of our best guess at what the eukarya and how they're related to each other are. The plants being up here in this large group called the chloroplastida with their outgroups, the red algae, the rhodophyceae right there. We also have the kelps and the brown algae over here in this large group called the Streminopiles. And then way over here in this large group called the Piscicata, we have the fungi. And then you and I are way down here in the metazoa with fish, insects, and all these other kind of animals. And this phylogenetic tree is going to be an important tree for you to go through and think about during this whole class. These represent some of the major groups that we're going to be talking about within the plant kingdom. We have our outgroups, the red algae over here, green algae, bryophytes, so mosses, lycophytes, ferns and their allies, gymnosperm, and then a large complex group called the angiosperm, or the flowering plants. And we'll refer to this chart quite a bit in future lectures. So to quickly review, plants and all their organisms have these binomial names of genus and species that allow us to get a lot of information and standardize what we're calling what. The organization that we put life in is a very hierarchical organization. Think of it as nesting dolls in together so you can understand quickly how things are related to each other. And using phylogenetic trees are a good way to teach us how traits evolve and when traits might have evolved for various reasons. And the last thing I want to leave you on is to do a quick exercise. And I want you to explore the taxonomy of Brassica rapa, including looking into the origins of the name Brassica rapa. As I mentioned earlier, all these names have very specific meanings to them, and Brassica rapa is included in that. Okay.